rice trick that fills your garden with earthworms. Soil that is more alive, more fertile, and almost free. Every year, the world spends over $200 billion on products to feed the soil. Bags of soluble nitrogen that wash away with the first rain, bottles of liquid fertilizer that spike growth for 2 weeks and collapse the soil's biology for 2 months. An entire system built on a premise so simple it makes you angry when you see it clearly, convincing you that your soil's fertility must be bought in a store every season, forever. And while that model accumulates billions, one of the cheapest ingredients in any kitchen in the world has been quietly doing for decades what no off-the-shelf fertilizer can do. Multiplying earthworms, awakening soil biology, and sustaining that fertility without you ever having to buy anything again. A handful of rice. What you are about to hear is backed by studies published in index scientific journals, by over a century of research in soil biology, and by agricultural traditions that survived generations without the need for a corporation to distribute them. This is educational content based on verifiable facts that anyone can look up. It is not an empty promise, it is biology, and that is exactly what makes it powerful. If you made it this far with that feeling that something doesn't add up in how we were taught to feed the soil, hit the like button now, because what comes next has real numbers, published studies, and a logic you won't find on any fertilizer label. And if you want this to reach you every time something new comes out, subscribe. What we teach here doesn't appear on industry-sponsored channels. So why earthworms? Because they are not a decorative detail of a pretty garden. They are productive infrastructure. 1 square meter of healthy agricultural soil can contain over 300 earthworms. Each of them processes its own weight in organic matter every day, transforming dead plant residues into something no laboratory has managed to replicate with comparable efficiency. Castings. Biological excretions so nutrient-dense that they contain 5 times more nitrogen, 7 times more phosphorus, and 11 times more potassium than the surrounding soil. Not in synthetic form, but in a bioavailable form, released slowly, exactly where the root needs it, without overdosing, without leaching, without subsequent collapse. In 2014, a meta-analysis published in the journal Scientific Reports analyzed 58 controlled studies spanning over a century of field research. The result was clear. The presence of earthworms in agricultural soils increases crop yields by an average of 25%. Above-ground biomass goes up by 23%, total plant biomass by 21%. The effects were most pronounced in soils with organic residues present, exactly the conditions that rice generates. A study published in Nature Communications in 2023 estimated that earthworms contribute to approximately 6.5% of total global grain production. Not as a metaphor, but as a measurement. They are food security infrastructure living beneath our feet, and almost no one knows how to feed them deliberately. And what do earthworms eat? Not dirt, not roots, not fertilizer. Earthworms eat microorganisms. Bacteria and fungi that colonize decaying organic matter are their primary food source. The more microbial activity there is in the soil, the more earthworms arrive, reproduce, and stay. The right question isn't how to buy earthworms, it's how to feed the organisms that feed them. And that is exactly where rice comes in 4 different ways, with different mechanisms, with published scientific backing, and with a total cost that amounts to next to nothing for an entire season. Before getting into the 4 methods, I need to tell you something that changed the way I see all of this. My father has a plot of land in Michoacan that he worked for 40 years, land that once produced with very little. But there came a time when that land started to shut down. Harvests dropped, plants took longer to grow. The soil looked dry and structureless, even after watering. When I went to see what was happening, the first thing I did was dig in 5 different spots on the plot. I barely found a single earthworm. The earth was hard, with no visible life, without the damp smell it should have. A neighbor of my father's, a woman over 70 who has spent her whole life working the land nearby, walked over to the plot one day with a handful of cooked rice in her hand and told me something so simple that I ignored it for weeks. She told me to bury it and wait. What I found when I started looking into whether there was any science behind what she told me took me by surprise. It wasn't folklore. It was documented biology, with studies, with explained mechanisms, with measurable results. And it made me understand that there is an enormous amount of knowledge about how to sustain soil life with what you already have at home, which never reaches the right channels because it doesn't generate recurring sales of anything. That knowledge, expanded far beyond rice, is what is gathered in Buried Knowledge, El Saber Enterrado. The digital book is not a summary of this video. It is a guide built for those who want to stop depending on the market to feed their family, using verifiable techniques applicable in small spaces without expensive inputs. It is not free, and it doesn't pretend to be for everyone. It is for those who have already understood that if the market fails tomorrow, they need to have a real answer, not a hope. The link is in the description. Now, the 4 rice tricks and why each one acts differently underground. 4 tricks. The first 2 are simple. The third has published field trials behind it. And the fourth, when you fully understand it, will change the way you look at every leftover grain of rice in the pot. Let's start with the most accessible one. The first trick is cooked rice with no salt, no oil, no seasonings of any kind. A handful pressed lightly onto the soil surface and covered with a layer of mulch to retain moisture. What happens in the next 24 to 48 hours has no equivalent in any off-the-shelf product. The gelatinized starch of the cooked rice begins to break down almost immediately. Bacteria arrive first, colonizing the surface of each grain and consuming the simple sugars released during decomposition. Fungi follow within days, extending their hyphae through the soft grains and projecting their networks into the surrounding soil. That concentrated microbial bloom is precisely the signal that earthworms detect and move toward. Earthworms do not eat the rice. They eat the microbial film that the rice generates. That distinction is everything. It explains why a few tablespoons of cooked rice attract more earthworms than a full application of synthetic fertilizer. Fertilizer feeds the plant. Rice feeds the organisms that earthworms consume. The signal is biological, not chemical, and the soil understands it better than any product label. Extension programs from Cornell, the University of Connecticut, Ohio State, Utah State, and Purdue University, all with published vermicomposting guides, list unseasoned cooked rice among the fastest decomposing inputs available for soil or worm systems. The consensus is identical. It activates microbiology in hours and generates a measurable biological response in days. 2 or 3 tablespoons per square foot covered with mulch. Repeated every 2 or 3 weeks during the season. Effective cost, 0. But this trick is just the appetizer. The second trick works deeper and for a longer time. Crushed raw rice. Uncooked starch breaks down more slowly than gelatinized starch. Instead of a microbial spike lasting days, it generates a sustained biological signal lasting weeks. Earthworms don't just arrive, they stay. They remain active in the treated zone throughout the entire season instead of dispersing when the initial bloom runs out. A 2016 study published in the International Journal of Environmental Health by Zamani and colleagues tested rice bran and broken rice residues as a substrate for earthworm systems. The resulting castings showed elevated levels of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium compared to controls without rice. The earthworms processed the rice-based substrate with sustained efficiency, not in a spike and crash. Multiple publications in soil biology and biochemistry and applied soil ecology confirm the principle. Available carbon sources, starches, and simple carbohydrates are the most effective driver of earthworm reproduction and biomass when integrated into soil or compost. Crush dry rice with a rolling pin or pulse it briefly in a blender. You are not looking for flour. You are looking to crack the grain open and expose the inner starch to soil moisture. 1 or 2 tablespoons per square foot incorporated into the top 2 inches of soil and covered with mulch. The grains absorb moisture, swell, and release starch gradually over the next 2 to 4 weeks. For the most complete effect, alternate cooked rice every 2 weeks for the quick microbial spike, and crushed raw rice once a month for the sustained baseline. Together, they create a continuous feeding cycle, but neither of the two has the scientific backing of the third. The third trick is the one with the most solid published field studies, and it uses something most people pour down the drain every time they cook. When you rinse raw rice, the cloudy water left behind contains dissolved starches, amino acids, B vitamins, phosphorus, potassium, and micronutrients leached from the surface of the grain. When that water ferments at room temperature for 2 to 3 days, it becomes a concentrated liquid microbial inoculant, not a fertilizer, a living culture. A 2023 study by Navi and colleagues, published in Helion and indexed in PMC, tested fermented rice wash water across 3 consecutive field planting cycles. The fermented rice water significantly increased populations of beneficial soil bacteria, including nitrogen-fixing bacteria and phosphorus and potassium solubilizing organisms. Soil bacterial diversity grew in every treated plot. Plant growth improved and nutrient uptake increased. 3 full field cycles with consistent results. A study by the same group published in Sustainability in 2021 documented the fermentation mechanism. 2 to 3 days at room temperature dramatically increases the concentrations of beneficial bacteria while elevating nutrient levels in the liquid itself. The fermented product delivers available nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium alongside a living microbial population, not in an isolated chemical form. The application: rinse 1 cup of raw rice in 2 cups of water. Keep the cloudy water in a jar. Cover it with a loose cloth to allow gas exchange and leave it at room temperature for 2 to 3 days. It will develop a slightly sour smell, a sign of active fermentation. Dilute it 1 to 1 with fresh water and apply it to the soil around your plants once a week. You are not feeding the plant, you are feeding the rhizosphere, the microbial community surrounding each root, the same one that earthworms consume, the same one that turns dead matter into living nutrition. Cost: the water you already used to rinse the rice and used to throw away. Now you don't throw it away anymore. But there is a 4th trick, and this one doesn't work in the garden bed. It works in the systems that supply the garden bed. And when you understand what it does, the previous 3 tricks become parts of something much bigger. The 4th trick is rice in the worm bin and in the compost pile. A 2018 study by Ilya Min and colleagues published in the International Journal of Environmental Research analyzed the interaction between earthworms, rice straw, and plants in controlled soil systems. The rice residues increased the body weight and biomass of the earthworms while reducing their mortality. The earthworms fed on the microbial communities colonizing the rice material and converted it into castings that measurably improve soil structure and nutrient availability. But the game-changing data comes from a study published in PeerJ in 2020. Researchers placed rice straw in 2 conditions, with earthworms and without them. In the mesocosms with earthworms, the rice residues were completely consumed in 4 weeks. In the mesocosms without earthworms, the same material remained largely intact after 18 weeks. The earthworms didn't just accelerate decomposition, they transformed it into a completely different process. They converted the carbon from the rice into soil organic carbon, increasing the total carbon content while simultaneously boosting enzymatic activity across multiple nutrient cycling pathways. 4 weeks with earthworms, 18 weeks without them, and in the end, 2 completely different soils. In the worm bin, mix 2 or 3 tablespoons of cooked rice per feeding with the usual scraps and bedding material. The rice accelerates microbial colonization of the bin's entire contents, which increases the feeding rate and casting production. In the compost pile, add a thin layer of crushed raw rice or leftover cooked rice between the green and brown layers. The starch accelerates the decomposition of the surrounding material, feeding the bacteria that break down cellulose and lignin. The finished castings and compost from those 2 systems return to the garden bed, where they continue to feed the earthworms you built up with tricks 1, 2, and 3. The system closes in on itself. Rice feeds microorganisms. Microorganisms feed earthworms. Earthworms produce castings. Castings build soil. Soil produces food, and the raw material for the entire cycle costs the same as the water you already used to rinse the rice before cooking it. What the industry sells by the season, this cycle sustains indefinitely with what you already have. Now I want to return to something I left pending at the beginning. My father's plot, the hard soil, with no earthworms, no structure, and the neighbor who arrived with a handful of cooked rice in her hand. I ignored her for weeks. It seemed too simple to be real. I am someone who needs to understand the mechanism before trusting the result. So before bearing a single grain, I started looking for studies, patents, university extension records, field trials. I found what I already told you in this video. I found more than I expected. So I did it. Cooked rice in 3 spots in my father's garden bed, fermented rinse water applied once a week, crushed raw rice incorporated into the top few inches of soil in the rest of the plot, without changing anything else, without adding fertilizer, without aggressively tilling the earth. At 3 weeks, I dug into the treated spots. The earthworms had returned, not in abundance yet, but they were there. At 6 weeks, the difference between the treated and untreated zones was visible to the naked eye. The treated soil had a different texture, darker, looser, with that damp smell it had been missing for years. My father, who has spent 4 decades reading soil, noticed it before I did, without me saying anything to him. What that neighbor knew without having read a single scientific study is the same thing that researchers from Piaget, Helion, and scientific reports ended up documenting with numbers and controls. That rice activates what the soil needs to recover on its own, and that what the soil needs cannot be bought in any store. If your land is at that point, or if you simply want to build soil biology that doesn't depend on what's available in the market next season, the path starts exactly here. In Buried Knowledge, El Saber Enterrado, the digital book, there is a complete system for those who want to take this further. Not just rice, but documented, historical, and verifiable techniques to produce food with what you have around you, in small spaces, with minimal or zero inputs in any condition. It is designed for those who have already asked themselves the real question. If the market fails tomorrow, what will my family eat? The link is in the description, and you can also access it by scanning the code on the screen right now. It is not free, and it is not made for everyone. It is made for those who already understand that food autonomy is not a hobby. It is a decision. What I just showed you today requires no investment, requires no prior experience, and does not expire. The rice you have in your kitchen right now can start transforming your soil this week. My father's neighbor knew it by heart. Studies confirm it with data. The question isn't whether it works. You've already seen that it works. The question is, when do you start? If this information has transformed your way of understanding the life that beats beneath your feet, and you want to reclaim the sovereignty of your land, subscribe and like the channel. We are unearthing the wisdom that others tried to hide so you can cultivate your own future. The next biological treasure will be revealed very soon. See you in the next one.